I'm going to talk about persuasive technologies. Part of the reason I want to talk about this is because some of the projects that are involved in this class relate to persuasion, and also more and more what we are sort of influenced by today, especially with technologies like Facebook, your smartphone, and so forth, is essentially more than ever persuasion coming at you when you don't even suspect it. And so I want to spend a little bit of time today talking about some of those kinds of issues. And first off, just so we're all clear, persuasion is the attempt to change attitudes or behaviors, and in this particular case, ideally, it's not about coercion, which implies force, or deception, which implies misinformation, right? So we're not doing politics here, right? We're trying to do good things. And so one of the folks who've sort of coined the term persuasive technologies is B.J. Fogg at Stanford, and he has a term called Cappedology, which is basically about the sort of the science of how to design, research, and analyze interactive computing products created for the sole purpose of changing people's attitudes and behaviors. And Stanford has a website, cappedology.stanford.edu, where he has a lot of this information. So, as far as mobile media is concerned, like smartphones, right? What's really sort of compelling and at the same time dangerous about this technology are all these, properties, right? So the benefits of persuasive technology, especially over mobile media, and as you compare it to traditional methods of persuasion, are things like, well, it's interactive, right? It can respond. It can come up with an electronic prompt which you have to respond to. It's more persistent than ever. It can nag you anywhere at any time. It can be anonymous, right? So let's say you're trying to quit, trying to cut down alcohol consumption, but you don't want the world to know this, right? And so this electronic aid could sort of encourage you to do certain things to cut down your alcohol consumption, but you don't have to let the world know that you're an alcoholic, right? There are also many modalities for influencing: audio, graphics, text, interactivity, touch, or even virtual reality. Right? It scales easily. When typically the way people solve behavioral problems is that you have a social worker, or you go to Alcoholics Anonymous type meetings, right? And what they found is that, say, for people who have rehabilitative needs, someone broke their leg and they have to go into rehab. Well, what they find is basically the doctors tell them, here's a sheet of exercises you need to do every day so that your legs get stronger and you'll be better. No one does them. They look at the sheet, and that's the end of it, right? And getting someone to do it requires a person involved, and they always do stuff when the people are there. That's why people get better performing having a gym trainer who's personally training them, as opposed to trying to get healthier by themselves through exercise. And so potentially this technology can scale much more rapidly than having the human person there, because it's cheaper to have this technology than the human. It can also go where humans cannot go, right? You may not want this person in your home all the time, but that technology is going to be at your home all the time. And it can potentially capture all this data and feed this back into some kind of server, so that people can start to track and discover what techniques work and what techniques don't work. Okay? This kind of tracking has been notoriously difficult for the health profession, right? Because this kind of tracking usually comes back to the doctor in terms of very fuzzy anecdotal information. You go to a doctor and you tell them, well, I got a tummy ache. That's about the extent of depth or detail a typical person would give to their doctor. And then the doctor would have to go through a whole series of questions to try and figure out what it is. It's like, where is the tummy ache? Right? It's like, well, about here. Does it hurt if you do this? Does it hurt if you do that? There's not a whole lot of precision, right, in the data. So potentially, if you had some kind of technology that you could wear all the time, you could provide that degree of precision. So in Fogg's behavior model for Cappedology, he identifies 5 types of behaviors and 3 types of durations. So the 5 types of behaviors people typically want to do are, they want to start some new behavior, or they want to sustain a familiar behavior, like flossing regularly, or starting a diet, right? This happens every January, right? The New Year's resolutions period. And in fact, you can see a spike in the sales of sports equipment roughly around December, January. Right? You want to increase a behavior like eat more veggies, or you want to decrease a behavior like eat less red meat. You want to stop a behavior like quit smoking. And there are different durations. Maybe you only want to do certain things just this once, or for a specific duration, or a permanent change. So that's how he sort of classifies those behaviors. And so to lay it out, he's got this little table where along the top he's got the different types of behaviors. So he's got things like do new behavior, one that's unfamiliar, do a familiar behavior, increase behavior intensity or duration, decrease behavior intensity, or stop a behavior. And then here are all the different durations. One time, for a set period, and then forever. Okay? So the idea behind this table is that what he hopes to accomplish is that you have more precision in trying to describe what kind of behavior you're trying to promote or stop or whatever, right? So that the next time, if someone were to encounter the same kind of, a similar kind of behavior, they can use the rules of thumb that were developed to solve that particular type of behavior, and hopefully those rules of thumb still reapply. So for example, let's say you identify that you're in this box, the purple path behavior, where it says buy more healthy eating options from now on, right? And there are certain set kinds of interventions that one could do to try and get this to work well. And maybe you have some other behavior that potentially falls into the same category. Can you then use those same techniques to help you achieve your goals? Okay. So what Cappedology is trying to do is potentially populate this entire map, so that you have at your fingertips all these tools that you can use to attack these behavioral problems. So Fogg says that basically 3 things need to happen for behavior to occur. There has to be a trigger, right? Which is, is the person being sufficiently triggered, or are they being triggered at the right time to perform the behavior? They have to have the ability to do that behavior. Okay? So can they perform this when this trigger occurs? Or can the behavior be made simpler to do? Right? The third one is motivation. Can they be motivated to start the behavior or continue the behavior? So what Fogg says is practically what he recommends people do is always start with the trigger, then move to ability, and then if necessary, move to motivation. Right? Maybe sometimes all it takes is a good trigger to get someone to keep doing something or remember doing something. The challenge, of course, in human augmentics is how do you provide the right triggers at the right time so that they then have the ability to do what they need to get done. So let's look at triggers. So the way Fogg sort of classifies them is that he has 3 types of triggers: facilitators, signals, and sparks. So he's got this little graph here with low ability, high ability, low motivation, high motivation. So if you are highly motivated to something, if your target person is highly motivated to do something, but they have low ability to do that act, then what you need, what he claims you need, is some kind of facilitator in your technology to help them to do this task, to make it easier for them to actually perform this task. If they're highly able to do the task and they're highly motivated, they just need a signal, right, to get them to do the task. Or if they're highly able, but they have low motivation, they actually need a little bit more of a signal. They need a spark to want to do the task. Okay. Now, one thing that's important to point out, and he also mentions this, is that sometimes triggers for a small behavior can lead people to perform a chain of other, possibly harder behaviors. So maybe the ultimate behavior you're trying to create, or trigger, is really hard to do. So instead of targeting that, you trigger something easier that hopefully will create a chain of events that will get them to do the harder event, harder behavior. The example I think is that maybe you're Nike and you want to get people to buy their shoes, walking shoes, running shoes, whatever. So maybe Nike will build an iPhone app that's designed to make you healthier. And all it does is to let you track how much you've walked in a day. And it's got colorful graphics. It's trying to persuade you to just walk around the block. And every time you walk around the block, you get a medal or something like that, right? And sure enough, by triggering you to try and do this regularly, you're going to discover that, my feet are starting to hurt. Maybe I should get more comfortable shoes. Oh, Nike makes some nice shoes for that, right? And so hence starts the chain of events. Okay, so it's hard to get people to spend $100 on your shoes, but maybe if you can coax them gradually, you can get to your target behavior. Okay. Well, let's say you've triggered them. Now you have to figure out if they are able, or how can you help them perform the task. So he claims that there are two paths to increasing ability, right? Now, the thing we have to always remember is, since we are developing technologies in this class, is that we can't always assume that people will know how to use these technologies, right? For example, take a modern day PC and take it to your parents' place, right? Talk about a revolt waiting to happen, right? So you have to be prepared for two possible paths. One of the paths is that if this person is not savvy about the technology, you have to first train them to actually deal with or use that technology. And then once you've trained them to use this technology, then maybe you can get them to perform the task. But there's two hurdles you have to deal with: training and then getting to perform the task, right? That's extra work you have to do. The other path, the simpler path, is to basically make the target behavior easier to do, right? And Fogg calls that simplicity. And he argues that simplicity is a function of your scarcest resource at that moment in time. So let's say time is your resource, right? If you don't have 10 minutes to spend and the target behavior requires 10 minutes, that's not simple, right? Or if it's a second. So whatever intervention that you have on your cell phone, it better take less time to do, right? Then you have time to give up, right? Or else people are just not going to do it. Or if money is a resource, right? If you don't have $1 and the behavior requires $1, then it's not a simple task, right? Okay. All right. So let's look at the third component, motivations. So in Fogg's model, he classifies motivation in 3 ways: sensation, pleasure or pain, right? For example, when you have an Amazon card every time you spend $2,500, you get a $25 back. So that's like a reward system, right? And I've heard that now there are gym subscriptions where you pay, and the more you exercise, the less you pay. But the less you exercise, the more you pay, right? So here it's sort of using a bit of reward, a bit of pleasure and pain at the same time to try and motivate you. Right? Then there's what we use in American politics, which is hope and fear, right? So if you're on the blue side, it's hope. If you're on the red side, it's usually fear. Funny how those colors work out. It works in the Star Wars universe too, right? The red lightsabers versus the blue lightsabers. Anyway. Then there's social persuasion, and he talks about social rejection or social acceptance, right? You've all seen on YouTube, the likes button, right? And then the dislikes button, right? And those are basically controls to help people not just be arbitrary about how they express themselves, but have some form of judgment scheme in there, and people would tend to prefer to be liked, right? And so you tend to hopefully, put up content that you think others will like, rather than stuff you think people will hate, right? So this is actually persuasion in action, right? YouTube is trying to persuade you to not put crap up there because people will rate you good or bad. So taken as a whole, you can sort of draw it out like this. You've got your trigger, your abilities, and your motivation. So for those of you who are working on the asthma project or the colonoscopy project, you can start with this, right? And you can say, in my particular audience, what kind of trigger do I need, right? And then, again with my audience, what kind of ability do I need? What kind of technology do I need to help them create this ability? And then, what kind of motivation? So you can sort of see this almost like a parallel coordinates kind of multi-dimensional graph, right? And maybe you have different possibilities. And at the end of this graph are all the instantiations of ideas that you can potentially implement. So here it's just a structured way of thinking about how you're going to apply this to your projects. So let's look at the asthma project as an example. So as you remember, this is the asthma project. The idea is you're building some kind of gadget you attach to two types of inhalers to control the medication, the emergency inhaler. The goal is to try and encourage people to use this regularly, because over time that helps them lower the need to use this or to go into hospitals, which is what's really expensive. There's also a peak flow meter where you blow into, and it will give a reading of how much force is in your lungs. And the idea is we would funnel this data to your smartphone, transmit this into the cloud, and then some smart algorithm would make predictions about what might happen to this person in the future and send them alerts. But also, in tapping into the social component, imagine if all these other kids had these devices, right? Maybe they can work in teams and sort of see that, Johnny's not performing up to spec. Can we send a little nudge, a persuasive message to encourage them to maybe remember to use their inhaler, right? Is that enough, right? So starting again with Fogg's table, basically the kids are trying to do a familiar behavior. They know how to use this device, this asthma device, right? They know they're supposed to do it regularly. What they have to do is basically keep doing it indefinitely from now on. So that sort of fits under the blue path behavior, which is somewhat similar to take daily vitamins from now on. Okay. So To achieve the blue path behavior, 3 elements must come together, right? You need the trigger, you need to make sure that the person is motivated and they're able to perform the task, as we mentioned before, right? And this combination has to happen over and over again to reinforce that habit. So, one possible trigger could be maybe as simple as regular scheduled alerts. It's not very creative, but maybe that's a start. Well, ability. Well, maybe you can trigger when the inhaler, well, if you trigger when the inhaler is not present, that's not particularly useful. Because the problem is kids will remember to keep their smartphones because they love their smartphones. But they're not so inclined to bring their inhalers. So what's the use of triggering it from your smartphone at home or out at school if you don't have the inhaler near you? So what can you do to maybe motivate them to always keep the two together, right? And this sort of comes to this point, inhaler is easy to use, but if you don't have it on you, then it's hard to use. Motivate the user to keep the inhaler close to them. Maybe you want to turn off their music privileges, right? Well, that's possible. That's the pain part of motivation, right? But maybe there's a way to create pleasure. So one of the ideas we had was, well, we talked about avatars, using avatars to motivate them to want to do this. And Giselle mentioned that she was interested in applying social cognitive theory because it basically says that by creating coping peers and also by creating coping peers, there are essentially peers who are more like you. The odds of you doing the same thing and succeeding are higher. So the idea was, well, what if the kids could create their own avatars? So they're sort of invested in the process of getting better. And then as a way to sort of encourage their peers to do this, they could maybe have the avatars create a music video. And there would be buttons to do different dance steps. Well, then I thought, well, what if you put gyros on the asthma inhalers themselves, all right? What if, in order to make the music videos, they would actually have to wave their asthma inhalers, like a Wiimote controller, right? So if they think of it as a game controller, well, kids would prefer to hold on to a game controller than to hold on an asthma inhaler, right? Maybe you can convince them to keep this close to their smartphone all the time, right? So that's just a thought. Okay. So this part I'm not entirely convinced of. This is what Fogg wrote on his website. As blue path behaviors are created, people do not require reassurance. Right? They basically enhancing motivation or step-by-step instruction. This might be true for the kids in this case. I'm not entirely sure if this is true for the kids because I think the kids are always going to constantly need this motivation. Now, right? The challenge is timing, and that I agree with. Right? If you don't have the inhaler available when the trigger goes up, it's absolutely useless. So timing is definitely very, very critical here. Okay, so given that, Fogg has in his book a whole bunch of different strategies you can use to try and create better triggers, better abilities, and better motivations. I'm not going to go through them all. I'm just going to go through just a few of them, just to give you a flavor for them. This we sort of already mentioned. He has a principle of reduction, basically trying to take a complex behavior and reduce it down to something simpler to do. There's also a principle of tunneling, which is to create these virtual rehearsals. Sometimes people don't think that they can do a certain thing. I don't know. Some of you musicians? Maybe play an instrument or something like that. So you've probably seen on YouTube someone playing an insanely cool piece of music, and you're going, "My God, I'll never be able to do that," right? But what you really discover is that if there's something that shows you how to walk through that process of getting to that end point, that will actually make you think, well, maybe it's not as impossible as I thought. Maybe it is possible to do perspective. So this is what he means by tunneling, right? Create a visual scenario which shows them that yes, it is possible for you too if you just follow these steps. You're not the only one to have tried to do this. Tailoring similarity, basically tailor to individual needs and interests. I mean, this is basically what Sergel wants to do with coping peers. Suggestion, offer suggestions at the opportune moments. That's obvious. Self-monitoring. Okay, so you see all these health devices, and the way they want you to work, and the reason why Google Health failed, is essentially in order to track your health, you have to type in the data into the system, right? So you've got to be super motivated to do that, right? No one's going to want to type in that data, right? Ideally, what you want is an electronic monitor to transmit that data into it. Now, you'd be surprised that a lot of people in the medical profession still think that a patient would just type in the data into their smartphone. I was just talking to somebody else in the medical campus, and they were thinking, oh, they would just type in that data into their smartphone. It's like, no, they won't. Right? But also, they're not aware that with modern technologies, maybe it's actually possible to get that data into the system, right? And in fact, one of the strangest models they had was, I go get a blood test, and the hospital will call me and read the blood test numbers to me, so then I could type it into my smartphone. So, as a technologist, I would think, well, couldn't the hospital's computer talk to my computer and transmit the data? Right? It blew their mind that might be possible. Right? Surveillance. This is essentially what Facebook does, right? Even though it's not couched as surveillance, right? Observing others increases likelihood of achieving an outcome, right? So if you see others who are, adhering to your smoking whatever adherence policy or what have you, chances are it will also encourage others to do the same. Okay. I won't go through all of them because it just keeps going on and on. So I just want to give you sort of flavor of these. So if you don't have the book, I would encourage you to at least pick up the larger book, the 2002 book, because he does have a full list of all these different principles that you can apply. This slide, by the way, at the end of the slide set, I have every one of these principles listed for your summary purposes. So you can just go through them, and in your projects, check off what you think might be potentially beneficial to your application area. Okay, this is just to save you some time. And then you can go and read the book to get all the specific details. Okay. Now, one of the valuable things he talks about is now that you're trying to create this persuasive technology, how do you go about doing it without completely frustrating the hell out of yourselves? Okay. So what he recommends is, number one, choose a simple behavior to target, not a big uber dream behavior. All right? In other words, your first project should not be something like preventing smoking, or getting them to lose weight, or actually get them to come to an ideal weight, because that's considered an incredibly challenging problem. Rather, he recommends very simple behaviors like getting people to take short breaks after 30 minutes at a desk. Right? It's not an uber goal. It's a mini goal. Can you get them to just get up off their butts and walk for maybe 5 minutes? That's it, right? Because that will translate to the larger goal. And then after that, if this is successful, you can always build on top of this simple behavior. So step 2 is he recommends that you choose a receptive audience. In other words, don't pick someone who doesn't want to lose weight in the first place, because you're selling them something that they're just not going to buy, and it's going to be a really tough sell. Okay? So oftentimes you'll find people who are early adopters, who are sort of adventurous souls, who are willing to try out this kind of stuff. So find them first. Okay? Step 3. Find what prevents the behavior, right? Are they missing motivation, ability, well-timed trigger. Okay. Step 4, we already talked about this. Choose a familiar technology channel. If you're talking about your parents and you're asking them to enter statistical data into a spreadsheet and then upload it, that's probably not going to work, all right? That's not the right technology channel for them, for that audience, right? Because if you do introduce some foreign technology, as I mentioned before, first you got to teach them to use the technology, and then you got to change their behavior. So you've got to first do a study to determine, can they even operate my technology before you can do a study on, can they change their behavior. Okay. Now, he mentions that in some cases, some projects are sponsored by, well, maybe like a phone company. So you're kind of stuck there. You're going to be using a phone as a piece of technology. Okay. And he says that's okay, but at least be aware of the other steps. So step 5 is basically, at that point, do your homework. Find relevant examples of successful persuasive technologies. Look for 3 examples that achieve similar behavior. Look for 3 that reach a similar audience. And look for 3 that use the same technology channel as the one you chose. Right. The goal is, don't make the same mistakes people have already made. Okay? So that's the purpose, essentially, of the second book I listed in the reading list. Right? The one on mobile technologies. Those are examples of things people have tried and failed or succeeded in doing. Some of it is really dated, I agree. Right? This is like cell phones before they had touchscreens. Like, oh my God, when was that? Right? And then step 6, imitate successful examples. When you find one of these examples that successfully used something, imitate it, and then enhance it and improve on it. Okay. Find their secret sauce. Right? Look at how they addressed motivation, ability, and trigger. Okay. Step number 7, test and iterate quickly. Right? Don't build this wondrous system, then take it to your audience and hope it worked. Because you're building a space rocket for the first time. It's not going to be for a first working version that's always perfect, right? So do very short 1-hour tests, not drown out user studies. Right? Expect to do he says expect to do about 9 rapid tests and modifications before you actually settle on a usable design, a usable system. Right? Then in step 8, that's where you're in better shape. You can expand on your success. You can scale the intervention to support a more difficult behavior or to a different audience, for example. Right? This is where because you have built a robust enough technology, you can actually start looking at larger population groups to study to validate your technology. Right? Okay. All right. Any questions so far? All right. So one of the things I want to touch on next is something called persuasive visualization. How do you basically use computer graphics or visuals to try and persuade someone to do something? Right? And in this lab, we do a lot of work in data visualization, which is basically about creating visual representations of data to reveal insight. Right? And the reason we think this is important is that, arguably over a third of your brain is devoted to visual information processing. And some people say it's as much as a half, right? I think I looked through all the literature, and conservatively it's about a third. I think that's where people sort of agree. That's it. But still, if you were to say, okay, if I have a lot of data and I don't want to use a visual representation to understand it, you're basically saying, I don't want to use a third of my brain to try and analyze this data. Okay, so that's why we think visualization is important. So the term persuasive visualization was coined by Vanvoor in a paper that was, I think, part of a workshop in Persuasive Technologies, Persuasive 2007. Persuasive Technologies is a conference that started by Fogg, our Stanford gentleman. And that's where he first coined the term persuasive visualization. And so here's an example of one that was published in 2010. And here the application was basically on eco visualization, getting people to be more aware about how they use energy so they could be friendlier to the environment, right? And so what they did was they had sort of two groups. They had a group that was given a kind of very typical computer-y kind of graph showing in yellow how much you left your computer idle on your desk versus how much the computer was actually on that day. Okay? So in other words, if this bar were smaller, that means that you were essentially using the computer well, right? It wasn't just sitting there acting as a pretty screensaver and draining power from the universe, right? And then the alternate representation was this coral reef, right? And basically, the coral reef would if you're doing good things, would start to flourish, and there would be, fish and plants and stuff, or it would degenerate and start going pale and start dying. Okay, so those were sort of the two representations that they wanted to compare against, right? And so what they found was this. So in the time log application, they found that people didn't look at that display more frequently at all. They really couldn't care less. They would look at it now and then, but there wasn't really any increase in interest in it, right? It also didn't show much behavior change, right? One of the reasons they said they weren't really that motivated to look at it was that there was no correlation with how it affected, something tangible like my electric bill. Whereas the Coralog, they found that people kind of liked the novelty of it, and they kept looking at it. It's like, is it doing better now? Is it doing better now? Right? And when they were surveyed, they used words like, well, I felt guilty that it was dying, or frustrated that I couldn't get it to come back, right? Or sad. I felt pressure that I had to keep it alive, right? And then when they were trying to repair it, they had words like, I was really happy, I was really encouraged, right? So a third of the users said that as a result of this, they would be more interested in looking at the numerical data in the time log. Right? So this is like a initial trigger to get them to be more numerically oriented, even though they weren't initially. Okay? And basically, people had a more emotional connection to this than to the bar chart. Okay? Here's another example you can use in the future. This one I'm sure you can use. So in 2006, they did this little study where they had in the coffee jar, you put the little jar you put in front of your coffee thing, and then you get people to chip in $1 every time they drink a cup of coffee, right? So above it, they had pictures, control pictures versus pictures of eyes, right? So in this graph, basically it shows over time, this is a British study, the number of pounds paid per liter of milk consumed, right? So early on, they had these eyes plastered over the jar, and they got quite a few contributions, right? Then they switched to pretty flowers, and the contributions dipped. And then they put another set of eyes in, and the contributions went up. So, this part was just a filter for sort of the novelty effect, right? And then the control, and so forth. Yeah.
Is it my impression, or the more meaner eyes seem to elicit greater contributions?
Well, this one's not.
Yeah, this is more natural. But
Yeah.
if you look on the very bottom, and then the one in the middle, like overall, if you average,
Could be.
the more menacing eyes.
I
seem
could
to
be.
I
I don't.
This is why we look menacing to our students.
Right, because they won't do
now
anything
we know why.
otherwise. So that simple picture stuck over a jar is persuasive. Right? All right. So the other thing I want to try and quickly talk about that's sort of related to visualization and persuasive visualization is that what we've seen happen a lot is that people have been saying, video games. I teach the class in video game design. Video games are really addictive, and if only I could take video game concepts and plug them into my technologies, maybe I can persuade people to do their exercise, right? And so remember when the Nintendo Wii Fit board came out? That board that you put on the ground and you stand on it and you do things, and then it measures your balance and then gives you exercises you can do. So everyone thought, this is it. This is what's going to get people to be thin, right? And what they found was essentially people bought it and they used it for 1 week and they never touched it ever again. Okay? Now, it's not to say it's bad or anything, but I think you sort of have to understand what are inherent in video games that is creating this addiction or this motivation to do things. So if you are applying a video game like intervention, you sort of have to understand what the properties are that create that outcome. So there is a book written by Jane McGonigal, who's a game designer, and she wrote a book called Reality is Broken: Why Games Make Us Better and How They Can Change the World. It's a pretty bold statement, but still, it's a neat book. You should take a look at it. So first of all, she starts out with a great definition of a game. Playing a game is the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. And if you think about it, that's true. What rational... why would we want to hit a ball into a tiny hole trying to avoid water hazards? Why is that fun, right?
You don't golf, do you?
No, I don't. But if I were to be a game designer, I would think, I would make But basically, the key term is unnecessary obstacles. You're trying to overcome unnecessary obstacles. This is an unnecessary obstacle, right? Just like in some ways Tetris, the fact that you have to try and align these blocks is an unnecessary obstacle. You don't really have to do this. It doesn't benefit your life, but somehow you're compelled, you're addicted to playing this, right? So the question is,
Well, and maybe you'll get to this later. And when looking at games, do you always have play and game in the same category? Because there's play, and then there's games. Are you approaching this specifically from a game standpoint or a play standpoint?
Both. Yes, they are very much linked. So let's ask this question. Why are people so willing to put themselves through this, right? For some people, running a marathon is fun. I personally don't think that's fun, right? Because I can't run worth a darn. But somehow people are motivated to do this. So there are 4 traits of games that you should be aware of. And I apologize for those who are taking my game class, and this is a little of a repeat. There are goals, rules, a feedback system, and voluntary participation. Okay? So the goals, that's pretty evident, right? This is the outcome that the player works to achieve, right? Gives the player a sense of purpose, focuses their attention, right? If you love these first-person shooter killing type games, what's the goal in that game? Shoot everything that moves, right? Right? Pretty simple. So what are the rules? Well, rules are in video game design are essentially what really creates the limitations of how you achieve those goals. Okay. Now, what's interesting about rules in video games is that, oftentimes, remember those board games you used to play when you were kids? Like Risk, right? Well, before you could play any one of those games, you first had to read the rule book. Remember that? And that was always the boringest part of the process, right? Video games have no rule books. No one ever reads a video game rule book because it doesn't actually tell you how to play the game. Playing the game teaches you how to play the game, which is a fundamental shift between traditional board games and video games. Video games have a feedback system. They have these medals that you win if you're able to achieve certain abilities or get past certain parts of the story. Interestingly enough, our military has a feedback system, right? Surprise, right? Where you do certain things, you get badges, and before long you get this big mass of blinky things. Actually, why aren't they blinking yet? You get this mass of badges to show how cool you are, right? All right. Voluntary participation. Right? Player knowingly and willingly accepts the goals, the rules, right? In other words, you are game for the game, right? If you don't accept these rules, the game will not be fun for you. Basically, you'll think the game is stupid and you won't play. Right? So the person has to buy into the game in order to enjoy it. Okay? All right, let's look at unnecessary obstacles, work versus play, right? So you guys, especially you guys, since you're working so hard on your dissertations and theses, you're always taught, your parents have always told you, play is bad, work is good, right? Some games and play have a bad connotation, right? You've probably heard of phrases like, well, you're just gaming the system, right? That's bad. Don't play games with me, that's also bad, right? This isn't a game, right? You've heard of all these, always been said. Or he's a player, right? Meaning he likes to play games with you, right? Instead of being honest, right? So there's a psychologist who basically claims that the opposite of play isn't work, it's depression. And what he means by this is, he pulls out the clinical definition of depression. And it's it says it's a pessimistic sense of inadequacy and a despondent lack of activity. So he flips the definition on its side, and basically the reverse of the definition is optimistic sense of our own capabilities and an invigorating rush of activity. According to McGonigal, there is no clinical definition of this reverse state. But for people who are avid game players, when they are playing a really good game, this is the state they're in. Okay. And this is what you're trying to accomplish, right? You really think you can actually do this, right? And you get this invigorating rush when you're trying to do it. Okay. So let's look at what work means in a video game. Interestingly enough, a lot of the work you do in video games are very closely tied to sort of evolutionary things that we've done to survive. And in fact, if you think about it, think of all the TV shows that are on these days, or at any time. Let's see, there's cop shows. What are cop shows about? Survival, right? What's the reality show, Survival, about? Survival, right? Well, if you look at all sort of the most popular activities that occur in video games, well, collect. Anyone play Pac-Man? Pac-Man, you're walking around collecting things. If you're like first-person shooters, what are you doing? You're hunting. if you like playing games like Myst, right? Remember Myst, some of you? It's about exploration, navigation. If you like these multiplayer online games, you're socializing, right? You're socializing because by socializing, you learn more about how to play the game better, right? You learn to use tools, right? The most exhilarating thing for first-person shooter players is they discover a new weapon, right? A new tool. And boy, is it fun to figure out all the crazy things you can do with it, right? You need to reproduce somehow. I'll leave that alone. To be physical, right? People like to dance. People like to fight, right? One of the most successful games ever produced is Dance Dance Revolution. Basically, you're stepping on these dance pads, and you're dancing somehow. Right? You also like to solve problems, to learn to adapt. So games like Tetris is about problem solving, right? So all these things you've designed over time as part of the evolutionary process to do. All they're trying to do is take this and put it into a game to give you challenges that you're familiar with. Okay? So we talked about the fact that in video games you're actually working. But it turns out that working is not enough. What they've discovered is that it has to be hard work. Right? So, how can hard work be fun? Right? So for example, if Bob Kenyon and I make you work really hard in this class by giving you, exams every week, you wouldn't picture that as being fun. So how can hard work be fun? Because in video games, it's about hard work. Okay? So they did a psychology experiment to find out what activities in the day are fun. So they basically use experience sampling, which basically means every now and then your iPhone will pop up a memo and say, answer the survey. What are you doing right now? And you check off the list. And then they'll ask you, are you having fun? Right? So they can start to correlate the things you're doing with your state of mind. Are you happy? Are you sad? Are you angry? And so forth. Okay? So how do you feel? So the common finding was that virtually every activity that's described as relaxing kind of fun, like watching TV, window shopping, doesn't turn out to make you feel any better. Right? We constantly report feeling worse afterwards when we started having fun. So vegging out in front of television isn't actually making you feel better. We feel less motivated, less confident, less engaged overall. So how can we be so wrong about what's fun? Right? We all know what makes us feel bad, right? So basically, she argues that when psychologists, what was that when we seek out relaxing fun, we're usually trying to reverse the negative effects associated with stress, right? So, but having easy fun, we often wind up moving ourselves in the wrong direction. We basically go from stress and anxiety to boredom and depression, right? You've worked hard all day, you come home, you think, the last thing I want to do is to work hard again. But in fact, by doing something that you want to do that's hard, that's what makes you more relaxed than just doing the complete opposite. That's the claim. So there's a term for that. It's called eustress. Eu from euphoria. Right? It's basically positive stress that you create for yourself. Right? It creates almost the same kind of response as negative stress. It produces adrenaline, right? Some of you play first-person shooters. You've had your heart beat crazily, right, at this critical moment, right? Your reward circuitry is activated, your blood flow increases, all the same kinds of properties. The only difference is your frame of mind. Okay? So when we are stressed, we are afraid of failure or danger. It makes us angry, combative, or want to escape and emotionally shut down, right? In eustress, however, I mean, these are examples of eustress that you're creating for yourself. You practice martial arts, that's a lot of stress. You're trying to climb a mountain and not fall to your death, that's stress, right? Playing a music instrument is actually not that easy, is it? To do it well, right? So this is stress that you're creating on purpose. Right? So when we choose our hard work, we enjoy the stimulation and the activation. And what they found was the highest level of interest and positive mood reported by experience sampling was when subjects are playing games, sports, card games, board games, computer games. Not when they were vegged out in front of the television. Okay. Now, one more emotional benefit of hard fun that they mentioned is this term Fiero, which means pride, evidently, in Italian. Right? You've probably seen this in tennis matches, right? When someone gets that incredible hit, they always do the double pump, right? Right? We throw our arm up in celebration. And so some folks in Stanford believe that Fiero is the emotion that first created desire to leave the cave and conquer the world. Right? And the more challenging the obstacle we overcome, the more intense that sensation. Okay? And that's a part of it. But surprisingly, there's more to it than that. Okay, but to get to that, you got to understand a bit about fun and failure. No one likes to fail. You don't want to fail in this class, right? That's not fun, right? We don't like to have you fail in the class. That's not fun either, right? But interestingly, when you look at video games, 4 out of 5 times gamers fail. So why would they put themselves through this scenario where they constantly see a screen like this? You are dead, or this is you. Right? So they did a study of a game called Monkey Ball. I don't know if you're familiar with the game. It's this path. There's a ball, the monkey running around in it, and you're trying to control the ball so it doesn't fall off the cliff. Right? Trying to collect these coins and so forth. Right? 32 players with biometric sensors to measure heart rate, skin conductivity, facial muscle activation so they can see when you're smiling, right? Goal was to identify what triggered the strongest emotional reactions, both positive and negative, right? So the hypothesis was the strongest positive emotion will come from earning high scores and completing difficulty levels, right? So the hypothesis was when you had your Fiero moments, you would be happiest, right? And what they found was that, okay, that is definitely there. People like to win. But what they found that was unexpected was people were more positive when they made a mistake. And the monkey veered off the side of the wall and died and all that stuff. And the reason why they were more excited by this was, again, something that video games do that nothing else can do, is that video games celebrate your success, your failure, in a glorious way. When you die, they show you, your limbs being splattered. It's a real reward to fail grandly. And the more grandly you fail, the more you're just rewarded by this failure. But the reason for doing that is to entice you to want to come back and do it one more time, because you think at the back of your mind, I think if I could just try this little trick this time, I'll get it. And then you'll fail again. But you were so close this next time, and you want to come back and try it again, right? And so forth. It's like the lottery, right? Those numbers were so close last time. This time I'll get those numbers. But of course the lottery is completely random. It doesn't really help you. Yeah.
How many cycles did they do of this though? Because it seems like eventually there's some diminishing returns.
There is.
You just get angry. And it ends up just stressing you out.
There is. I don't know if they've done a study on that, but from my personal experience, it really depends on the person. Some people like to grind, some people don't. My limit is usually 5. Andy, Professor Johnson, his limit is usually 2. So the way we control for that, and what games do to control for that, is they let you adjust an initial difficulty level. Easy, medium, or hard. Now the problem with that is that once you've committed, sometimes you're stuck with it, and you don't enjoy the game as much because it was too easy. Or you don't enjoy a game as much because it was too hard, right? So controlling that carefully is challenging. Most games tend to require you to make a selection. Some better games try to be adaptive. I played a game where it says, you failed for the past 5 times. I'm going to not tell you this. I'm going to dial down your opponent, so it's just a little bit easier, so you can get past it. All right. So I'm kind of short on time, so I'm going to just start to close with just a one slide to try and explain how games difficulty is controlled, because we're just about just touched on that. How do you create an experience that isn't so easy it's boring, or isn't so hard that you get frustrated, that you wouldn't want to keep playing? So there was a psychologist at I believe Chicago who came up with this concept, and the concept is called flow. And he basically says that musicians, athletes, even programmers enter this state of flow where everything seems to connect. The world seems to stop, right? And you're in this euphoric high, right? You're writing code like crazy. You're writing music, or you're playing music like you just wouldn't believe, right? Or runners say they have their second wind, or although I guess for runners it's part of the endorphins, right? And so the question in video games is, how do you constantly create this flow throughout to keep the person playing? And as it turns out, to adjust the level of difficulty in a game is actually not linear, like this. This is not how you want to create the experience. In fact, if you have ever participated in any kind of physical activity where you had someone coaching you and training you how to do this, what you'll find is that what they'll typically do is that they will start out very gently, and then it gets more difficult, and then it tapers off a little bit. But this tapering off is still harder than what you started with, right? But you're not constantly under the pressure to really learn a lot of new things very rapidly. So there's a bit of a relaxation period. At each point, you've sort of acquired new skills, and you're building your vocabulary skills over time. And interestingly enough, if you think about the games that you've played, there's the notion of a boss at the end of every level of the game, right? Boss, for those who don't know, is the big Uber guy that somehow, beats the crap out of you. It is the ultimate challenge for that level. The bosses are usually situated right there at the peaks, because they've taught you everything you need to defeat this boss. This is the climax point. Once you finish destroying the boss, your heart rate is probably shot through the roof, right? You're tired, and you just want it to calm down a little bit, right? To throw in another boss at that time would probably be a bad thing, because it would just be too exhausting. So what you typically find is that the dip, and then the increase. Okay. All right. So just to summarize, games are addictive because they involve hard work that we choose for ourselves. Okay. They are familiar in the types of tasks they involve. They're based on evolutionary survival needs. They provide new things for us to learn that challenge us. The moment you stop learning, the moment the player stops learning in the game is the moment where the player finds the game boring. Wow, learning. Geez, people actually want to learn. They have rules that are learned through experimentation, not by reading a rule book. They celebrate failure, right? And games increase difficulty in accordance to the concept of flow. Any questions? Yeah.
I mean, question for both, installing a new behavior in some sort of subject of technology, or building some kind of humanist goal into, or converting playtime into labor, which contributes to humanist goals. Like which party on either side of these technologies gets to make that decision in the first place? Because if say the technologist in all cases gets to make the decision of or that's their value set which decides what goal is reasonable to set the technology. If that's always the case, then even if it's a benefit to the subject, it would necessarily fall under coercion, even if it ends up as a good result.
Right, it very well might. And Steve is going to address some of those issues of ethics, right, in the design of technology. What we're hoping to do, essentially, is that we know that sort of inevitably technology is going to enter our lives, right, in ways that we don't suspect, right. Well, the best we can do is just to start to think about all those sort of ethical issues in the process of that technology development, but also ask the important question during the technology development, which is there another way of doing it that doesn't involve necessarily technology, right? That might actually be better. Technology might be an overkill in some situations, right? And when we were in Africa, that was the thing we learned. The computer scientists we'll use a GPS system and we'll triangulate this and we'll get the trees there. And then when we finally got there to try to do this, in reality, it was easier to just get a bunch of rope and measuring tape, right? Because it requires no power source, no satellite, no whatever. It just was rope, right? Physical, technology, as it were, right? So that's some of the questions you should always ask yourself. Is it really necessary to use this technology in this case? The way you want to think about it is, if you are to introduce this technology, is it going to bring in benefits that are really well beyond what a previous form of intervention could possibly hope to achieve, right? And that would be a more sort of ethical way of approaching it. Okay. So lastly, I just want to leave you with this final words. I don't know if some of you have seen this really kind of neat advertisement, since we're talking about persuasion.
saying?
I wrote a saying in different words.
Persuasion. This is from a company called Purple Feather. They design online content.